Hello and welcome to Sustainability Uncovered from Edie, the podcast for anyone working in or passionate about sustainability and climate action. Coming up in today's episode, which is all about having a sustainable summer. Aviation generates around 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and the industry shows no signs of slowing growth after rebounding following a lull during the pandemic. Sustainable aviation fuels, or SAFs, are often seen as the key to unlocking low-carbon air travel, but the technology has struggled to scale so far. To learn more about the challenges and what might be needed to realise these fuels' potential, we speak with BloombergNEF.
I think we've just seen, over the last couple of years, project announcements outstrip demand quite significantly. And so that's where we're seeing a little bit of that pullback. But I think we're still seeing a strong growth trajectory for renewable fuels and SAF specifically.
As well as being a time for jet setting abroad, summer is also prime festival season, but with millions of attendees flocking to events just in the UK alone, if not managed responsibly, they can come with a hefty waste and carbon footprint. Shambala Festival shares how they're doing things differently, having embedded sustainability and social value from the start.
There's something which underpins Shambala, which is that we can make a contribution to the world. And so sustainability for many years was the focus of that contribution, both in terms of how we could reduce the impacts of the festival, but how we could show some leadership and how we could provoke useful conversations.
All of that and more in this episode of Sustainability Uncovered. Hello and welcome along to Sustainability Uncovered, hosted by Edie, the UK's longest running business-to-business media brand focused on all things environmental sustainability. So we're just coming up to mid-August 2026 and you're listening to the voice of Edie's acting content editor Matilda. I'm back in the studio today and I'm joined by our editor Matt.
Hello.
And our senior reporter Sidhi.
Hello.
So guys, hello, good to be back in the studio. How are you both doing?
It is good to be back in here. It's probably like the coolest room that I know.
It is.
And I know we're talking about summer, but it's been so hot. And not Elcor bad hot, which we've obviously kind of spoken about on the podcast before, but just constant days of heat and no rain. That's just kind of sent me a little bit kind of frazzled, I think, mentally. Yeah. So yeah, literally the only reason I'm doing this podcast is because this is a nice cold room and my house is too hot and even upstairs in the office is too hot. So yeah. I'm here in body alone, spirit clocked out.
Perfect. Okay, thanks so much. Sidhi, how about you?
Likewise. It's been really hot, especially I think where I live in London. Some of these apartments are not built for heat in mind, and we're seeing more and more research about it as well. And the other day I was working from a park because it was just too hot in the apartment and the park just looked so sad. It was completely dry. You could see like the insects out trying to find any kind of shade, water. So it was a very sad sight, and I think we're seeing more of that online as well. The wildfires across the Europe, drought kicked in England as well, so it's been a heavy summer.
It has, yeah. I mean, jumping away from the realities of the climate crisis, this is obviously the first episode that we're doing with a newly, well, not completely new, but newly rejigged government. So we've got Miata Fanbule, who's a new energy sec, and then Angela Eagle is back at DEFRA.
Such a good name for someone to lead DEFRA.
I know, yeah. She was destined for the job, and Sidhi, obviously your fave Ed, he's...
I don't know if you guys have seen his social media content, but he's doing reels based off all the press trips that he's doing internationally. And I love how he's putting climate change at the front of mind and at the center of his conversations. I think that's kind of a very strong angle for foreign security, national security for the UK. But I've just been loving his content. He's so social media savvy, or his team. But yeah.
Number one fan. And Matt, in terms of what we've seen from Andy, first name basis, seen from him so far, what seem to be his kind of priorities and what do you think we could expect from this government?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite clear that this is about stimulating growth outside of London. Kind of devolution is very big on the agenda, which I'm all for, by the way. I think that makes perfect sense. There's been regions of the UK that's been neglected for far too long. And it does feel very much about economic rebalancing across the country, doing some stuff to immediately try and kind of alleviate the cost pressures that everyone's finding themselves in, certainly for the kind of more vulnerable wage brackets as well, which I think is all like promising stuff, and it's all good, from bus fares to the recent news about certain types of people in jail that won't be let out. I won't delve into it, it's not that relevant, but the optics and I think the policies coming out of it seem strong. I think my worry is that I think climate is has taken a backseat immediately. Obviously there's the energy bill relief stuff which is coming in, has been good, but news about even the bus fare cap coming out of the net zero kind of funding is an issue in itself. And I think it is essentially what any kind of business or government grapples with. It's short-term pressure alleviation against long-term resiliency against climate change. And that balance has always been tipped in favour of short-term mindsets. It is just the way that kind of equation is answered at the moment. So we'll have to wait and see. There's obviously ruminations around approvals of Gatwick runway, oil field projects as well, which could have minimal impact for our economy, but quite big impact on our climate footprint as well. So I think in general, I've been a big fan of the policies he's introduced, but I do think there has been a fair bit lacking on climate in general, especially as we head into kind of a tri-COP year. It'd be interesting to see how much focus is given to topics like land management and nature and biodiversity, and then energy and electrification feels like we've got the strongest kind of need for that in terms of economic aspects. But with what we're seeing in the news headlines around drought and what that's doing to crops and even kind of property value, it'd be interesting to see if the government does maybe switch focus to like nature resiliency as an immediate priority rather than what is probably a mid-term priority right now.
I mean, fingers crossed. It's kind of tricky to gauge what, as you said, he hasn't kind of said anything either way on nature. Focus has definitely been on reindustrialisation, like local production, making more resilient industries, whether that's farming, agriculture, and obviously a healthy ecosystem underpins that. So yeah, it'll be kind of interesting to see how that pans out in the coming weeks and months. But coming back to the focus for today's episode, and it's actually fitting that today was the first day in about 2 months that I woke up and it was like raining and grey, now that we're talking about summer for the podcast. And I know Matt and I have got some exciting plans for our annual leave, so I'm packing up and moving. And Matt, I think you said you were painting the living room.
Yeah, I'm going to repaint the living room and re-nail down the skirting boards. Wow. So I'll look back on this summer fondly, I think.
Nice, okay. Sidhi, however, you have a slightly more exciting break planned. So you're...
Yeah, I'm travelling to New York, which I'm really excited for, but of course the guilt of travelling using a flight. It is something that I try to do less of, so I only really take one big international trip if I am to see my family. But apart from that, I am excited to see New York. Mum Dani's New York, so I want to see, how they have incorporated heat resilient infrastructure, what kind of public grounds or community spaces there are. I'm really looking forward to that because I know a lot of initiatives have been announced in the recent months. And kind of sad that I'm going in August because the New York Climate Week is in September. So I think I'm just missing the fun. But yeah, still excited.
No, I'm definitely very jealous. And on the topic of flying abroad, Sidhi, you spoke with energy specialist Jade Patterson from BloombergNEF. So can you tell us a little bit more about that conversation?
Yeah, it was a great conversation. We talked about the scaling of sustainable aviation fuel, really. I think a lot's been happening in the industry in terms of we've got new mandates in place, we've got new projections out for how the scaling of the tech is looking like, and for the first time BNEF updated their outlook and the scale of what the projections were, they have reduced it a bit because they don't think the market's scaling to the point. And so it was an interesting conversation because then that means, all the airline companies, but then businesses are relying on SAF credits, book and claim credits to meet their Scope 3 targets, how that kind of trickles down and what kind of risk businesses need to be thinking about by 2030. looking forward a bit more 2040 in their supply chain. So it's a great conversation. I've always found SAF a bit tricky in terms of as a technology, because you the feedstock,
so different.
The feedstock conversation around it as well. It's like, can you really scale it in a sustainable way? And we're seeing more and more conversation around that happening as well. So yeah, it was a great conversation. I'm excited for people to listen to it.
So here is that interview now in full.
Hi Jade, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me today.
Of course, well, thank you so much for joining us today. As we are in peak summer right now, and everyone is planning their holidays, taking a time off to travel, which kind of nicely brings us to the discussion today on sustainable aviation fuel. Many of the airlines had been banking on SAF to scale to meet their decarbonization goals as aviation as a sector expands. However, according to a recent BNEF outlook, global renewable fuel producers have revised their 2030 capacity outlook for the first time, seeming not so confident that SAF production will meet the scale of projection once predicted. Could you provide insight into what has changed? Is this primarily about technology readiness, financing, policy uncertainty, or is there something else?
Yeah, I think if I had to kind of summarize it into one word, I would say policy is going to be the biggest driver in this slowdown. When we think about renewable fuels in general, we're typically looking at renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. And, these products they're co-produced with one another. Today, most of the renewable fuel capacity actually is dedicated to renewable diesel used in road fuels. But SAF is actually kind of increasing its share over time. And although it's maybe less than 5% of production today, it's growing to almost half of the production by 2030. So we are seeing SAF capacity and therefore supply continuing to grow. So even though overall renewable fuel capacity has been brought down slightly from our last forecast, we're still seeing capacity expected to reach over 20 billion gallons compared to only just 3 billion gallons in 2020. And that's 20 billion gallons by 2030. I should say. So still a lot of growth coming, but I think some of the slowdown was, just a little bit of overzealousness in the broader market and production. And so we kind of had to tailor that back a little bit to actually align with where demand is going. And so, we can get into it a little bit more too, but I think we're seeing the SAF market actually capacity there specifically start to outstrip demand as well. And I think that demand is again driven a lot by policy and mandates and incentives as well as corporate demand, which I know is a lot of the focus here today from those customers. So I think it's a matter of kind of keeping these two supply-demand forces in check. And I think we've just seen, over the last couple of years, the project announcements outstrip demand quite significantly. And so that's where we're seeing a little bit of that pullback. But I think we're still seeing a strong growth trajectory for renewable fuels and SAF specifically.
That is really interesting. And another thing that the outlook points out is that a lot of these SAF projects are still in the financing or feed stage. From your perspective, what are the biggest barriers preventing these projects from reaching final investment decision and commercial production?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, again, if I could summarize it in one word, I'd say oversupply. We're seeing, compared to last year, I think we had around 600 million gallons of SAF consumed in 2025. By 2030, we see that growing to around 4.1 billion gallons. And that's down a little bit from our last forecast, from last year's forecast in 2030, due to a little bit of a pullback in policy by the U.S., where we saw incentives reduced there. And so, I think when we look at our base case scenario for actual capacity, we're actually sitting at 6.8 billion gallons. So that means basically, even at today's kind of outlook, you would only need around a 60% utilization rate to meet demand in 2030. And so that's a challenge for producers, right? If you look at typical refinery, they want to be running as close to 100% utilization as possible to maximize their revenues. Obviously, they still have some downtime, so they're not going to be at 100%, but typically 90 to 95% is a sweet spot there. So even now, if we just look at the SAF market, we're well oversupplied to meet that 4.1 billion gallons that we project by 2030. And I think that's in line with a lot of other research firms today. If you look at Wood Mackenzie or S&P, I think everyone's kind of in that 3 to 4 billion gallon range of demand. So again, we're just kind of oversupplied. So to answer your question, I think what that means is if you're planning a project today to produce SAF, it's really challenging, I think, to get financing because it's challenging because the market is already kind of oversupplied and, we're going to see depressed margins as a result of that. So it would be, challenging to build a new project in this environment right now.
Brings me to my next question on green premium. So SAF is significantly more expensive than conventional jet fuel at present. When you're talking about the oversupply in the market, what does that mean for the green premium? Will it remain a luxury addition, or do you see the technology reaching a cost parity anytime soon?
At the heart of it, really where it comes down to is we see premiums actually remaining fairly high. And so when you look at the cost of producing SAF versus jet fuel, you're looking at 2 to 4 times the cost of conventional jet fuel. And so that's unsubsidized. So there's obviously subsidies that can kind of close that cost gap or that reduce that green premium. But, absent those policies, it's going to remain more expensive, right? And so we don't see that green premium really shrinking over the next 5 years or even really beyond that. And that's really because a lot of the SAF today and over the next 5 years will continue to be derived from SAF produced through hydroprocessing or HEFA-based SAF. This relies on things like fats, oils, and greases to produce the SAF. And one of the things to note about this technology and really why we project these green premiums to remain elevated is because feedstocks, so that's you use cooking oils or your animal fats that go into making the SAF, that is around 80% of the overall cost of production. And so unless you have a pathway to reduce those feedstock costs, it's going to be challenging to make that SAF less expensive. And a lot of these feedstocks are going to be tied to vegetable oil markets. So that's like things like soybean oil, palm oil. Those are what kind of set the benchmark price for a lot of these feedstocks. And so the challenge with, bringing those costs down, right, you need to reduce your cost of producing soybean oil or palm oil. And, those are very mature technologies. And so we don't forecast a huge decline in the cost of these feedstocks over time. And so I think we're going to still, even though we have this oversupply, we're still going to see producers are going to have to charge a minimum to meet their cost of production, which is going to be tied to those feedstocks. So really, bad news, we don't see a huge decline in the overall production costs over the next 5 years. But, as you kind of look out further on down the road, and I'm sure we'll kind of get to that, there's more other technologies that can come in to the fold and help kind of come down the cost curve that are not as reliant on feedstocks.
Thanks, Jade. And speaking of feedstocks, there are a lot of sustainability frameworks that strictly prohibit the use of crop-based biofuels due to biodiversity loss and other food security issues. I'd be interested in hearing if you think the technology could be scaled to the needs of the industry without really relying on food crops.
That's a good question. And yeah, I think that really gets to the heart of the challenge within SAF and biofuels today is how do you go beyond that feedstock, its limitations, right? There's a limited amount of used cooking oil, animal fats in the world. We think that even with a limitation today, we think we can probably meet the 2030 goals, actually. So there's enough wiggle room over the next few years to, I think, increase collection rates and kind of squeeze out the last little bits there for hydroprocessing. So in the short term, I think the answer is, we have the capability to do that without increasing food crop demand. I think beyond that, that's where you need to see some innovation come in from either two different sectors. You could see innovation and reduction of cost on the feedstock side. So that's things like novel crops, whether it's winter canola, where we're seeing some joint ventures between oil and gas companies and seed providers. So you could see some innovations there that use crops that are not food and also don't incur additional land use to produce them. So there's some technologies where you can grow crops on existing farmland called double cropping, where you grow kind of in the fallow period. So there's a lot of innovations going on there. I don't want to oversell that. I think we're still, a ways away from seeing those crops have a meaningful impact on supply. But I'd say feedstock innovation is a big one to watch. And, I think there's a lot of room to grow there and a lot of opportunity where we're seeing actual dollars flow in there. And then the obvious second one, right, is technology innovation. So, there's a lot of other technologies, whether it's power to liquids or alcohol to jet or gasification, that can tap into technologies that are less reliant on food crops or feedstocks that compete with food supply that I think will, help us unlock some of that supply constraint for SAF. And so, coming back to your original question, I do think it's possible to scale SAF without increasing competition for food, but we're going to need to see more investment dollars and more partnerships around these new feedstocks production and new technologies in order to do so.
Just to follow up on that, in a hypothetical situation where the investment's not matched by what the demand is and SAF volumes don't grow as quickly as one hoped, how should airlines prioritize the limited supply? Should it go to long-haul flights where alternatives are scarce, or should there be another approach they should be considering right now?
I might actually kind of rephrase that a little bit. I think if you think about airlines as sort of just this passive, like they take supply, whatever the market gives them, I think that maybe a little bit selling it short. I think what I would like to see and where I think airlines are starting to move the needle is actually being more aggressive at investing in new technologies and investing in new pathways for producing SAF. And so one example is recently One World Alliance announced the Breakthrough Energy Ventures Fund. And so what this fund does is it's, I think, $150 million that they're going to invest venture capital money into new technologies. And I think, while there is seen as somewhat of a shortage of SAF, obviously, right, we're only projecting SAF will be around 3 or 4% of jet fuel by 2030, which obviously is well below where we need to be in order to meet deep decarbonization. I think where airlines can come in is providing some of that demand signal as well as helping invest in new technologies. And so I think, I would like to see them play a more active role. And I think we're seeing that, right? And signaling like, hey, we need this SAF. That also looks like maybe partnering to push forward policies, right? And we're seeing that in the U.S., for example, where I'm based. We've seen multiple state tax credits be passed. One that stands out to me is the Illinois SAF tax credit. It's a $1.50 per gallon tax credit that, helps reduce the cost of SAF to airlines. And so I know that was a big partnership, I think, with like United and obviously some of the producer side in Illinois to get that across the line. But I think, more of those initiatives and, more of that investment that they can provide just gives credibility to any producer that's trying to raise money or trying to, work on new technologies. Because like going back to what I said earlier, we got to see some new technologies break through to bring down the green premium as well as kind of break through the feedstock crunch.
And we have spoken about market signals, demands, and we have spoken about the motives that airlines have to invest in this technology. But I would also be keen to hear your thoughts on policies. Do you think the policy framework across different regions, well, America, but Europe and UK, because UK has its own mandate, Europe has its own policies around SAF implementation. Do you think the policy framework is solid?
At a high level, if we kind of take a step back and look at the current policy framework for SAF, it's pretty much a giant patchwork across different regions globally, right? You have Europe with SAF mandates, maybe some incentives mixed in there at the airport level. In the US and kind of North America, you have more of an incentive approach, tax credits and renewable fuel standards and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a mixed bag on what policy approach is being used. What I will say, just at a basic level, I think if we want to see SAF adoption grow, I think mandate is the best way to do it, because by creating a mandate, you give demand certainty to producers to go and invest and put capital and debt towards a project. If you look at any of the projects that have actually raised debt or capital through debt markets, most of that is going on in Europe. If you look in the US, which was more of an incentive approach, which is obviously more risky, right? Credit prices can shift, tax credits can expire. Most of that is being raised through off balance sheet by those companies. So they're not able to actually raise capital. And that obviously makes it challenging to build capacity if you can't access financing. So I would say mandates are where I see most of the success. But then you obviously hear a lot of pushback from airlines saying, we don't want this to be mandated where there's not enough supply to meet that. And I think that's fair. But ultimately, I think where we're at today, if you set a target, a mandate that's reasonable, I think you can see the production grow and you'll see innovation happen to meet that over time. Even if it is a little bit painful up front and costs are high, I think those will be overcome, right? I think there's the cliche, right? The cure for high prices is high prices, right? So if you see those high margins, companies will flock to that. They'll figure out how to reduce those costs. I actually come from the oil and gas sector originally where I started, and I think obviously those refiners are really good at figuring out how they reduce cost of production and margins and squeeze out every efficiency that's possible. So yeah, that's my take, is I think we need to see more mandates to actually have effective growth of SAF over time. And then pair that with reality of what's capable today.
Many of our listeners also represent corporations with public science-based targets that have Scope 3 emissions reduction targets in place for 2030, in addition to obviously airlines. And these companies are relying on airlines to scale up SAF so they can help reduce their logistics fleet emissions. Based on the outlook that BNEF just published, should corporate sustainability officers be confident in how the market is going in order to meet their 2030 targets, or should they be thinking about a plan B?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's challenging, right? Supply is uncertain, right? But also demand is uncertain, right? If you look at corporate demand, it's really hard to put a number on that without some sort of mandate. How certain are you that corporates are going to show up and create that demand? I think we are seeing a lot of new registries and kind of programs that are allowing for corporates to buy Scope 3 emissions credits, right? And I think that's really key in order to kind of scale up SAF, right? You need to be able to have a liquid market, right? Because SAF is also obviously very small right now. And so it's hard to get it to all different places. So if you're a corporate and you want to buy SAF somewhere, being able to use what's called book and claim to buy the environmental attributes, even if you're not uplifting the SAF or consuming the SAF physically, being able to buy that emissions credit, I think, is really important. And we're starting to see that take off. And so I think coming back to your question of should corporates be concerned about meeting their targets or not, I think really the question is how much are they willing to pay? If they're willing to pay the premium, the green premium, I think there'll be producers willing and able to meet that demand. But I think, right, it's a question of how much, what's the cost of carbon they're willing to go up to. And that's a question I can't answer. I would love to know the answer to that. And it obviously changes from corporation to corporation. But what I will say, kind of to give an example of what success looks like, DHL has done a really good job of adopting SAF into their logistics. So in 2025, 10% of their jet fuel consumption was composed of SAF, which is miles above, any other airline. So if you look at just IAG, kind of the closest, they were at 3% SAF, just for comparison. So I think what's made DHL so successful, and maybe kind of an example that corporates could follow, is DHL has done a really good job of passing along the green premium to their customers. DHL obviously has their margins, their revenues, their costs to meet, and so they can't bear the whole cost of SAF. They can probably afford a little bit, but being able to kind of pass that down the value chain, they have a program called Go Green where the customers opt in to pay more for their freight to ship it, and that helps DHL go and buy the SAF at a premium, double the cost of jet fuel, and helps them kind of obviously remain profitable as a business. And so I think those types of examples where you can unlock that demand from your customers that want to be green or want to work with a company that has sustainable targets and is doing the right thing, I think is the key there. So figuring out an efficient way to pass along those costs of SAF is going to be really important.
Great. This has been such a fascinating conversation, but unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for this segment. So thank you so much, Jade, for your time again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Big thank you again to Jade for his time. We're going to take a really short break now, but don't go anywhere, because next up we'll be talking with Chris Johnson, the co-founder of Shambala Festival, to explore how it's making sure that people and planet remain the focus. Hello and welcome back to the Sustainability Uncovered podcast with me, Matilda, Matt and Sidhi. So if you're not holidaying abroad this year, you might be filling your weekends with one of the thousands of live music events happening across the country and the world, whether that means braving the temperamental British weather and potentially spending a few days in a waterlogged field, or heading into the city for a day festival.
Or singing to yourself whilst doing house painting.
Perfect.
Pretty much a festival, right?
That's just as exciting. Yeah. Either way, when we're enjoying ourselves at these events or at home, it can be easy to forget the work that goes on behind the scenes to minimise the environmental impact. So to get an inside look at one of these events, I sat down with Shambala's co-founder Chris Johnson to see how the event has gone about balancing environmental impact and social value from its origins, as well as how the organisation is pivoting to a new, unique ownership model. So here is that conversation in full now. Hello and welcome back to Sustainability Uncovered. So I'm joined by Chris Johnson, who's the co-founder and managing director of Shambala Festival. So thanks, Chris, for joining. I know you're only kind of a few weeks out from the event, so I'm sure things are mad busy on your end, but thank you for taking the time to chat today. If you could just give us a quick intro into what Shambala is and your role there, that'd be great.
Sure. As you suggested, I'm the managing director, but actually it's my last day. We'll be talking today about why it's my last day, so I'll leave that on the side for now. But I'm one of the co-founders. We're 26 years in, which is sort of hard to believe. But I've always led on sustainability. We've always been aligned as a group of co-founders and as a Shambala team, but seem to have a sort of life calling to make a contribution to climate. And yeah, I've been the operational lead, the festival director, the MD, and I'll be moving into a sustainability focused role next year, which is really exciting for me. So Shambala, obviously I'm biased because it's a life's work for us as a group of people. And I love the story of Shambala. It was 100 friends in a field with a farmer's trailer, a couple of portaloos and some mates who were in bands, and we borrowed a sound system from our university students' union at the time. And I don't think any of us had any idea really where it might go. And so, 25 years on, we're 25,000 in a field. And I would say you genuinely have to go to believe it. It's the most wonderfully, amazingly diverse, creative, warm-natured, community-driven event for all ages. We have 37 stages and venues, from woodland arts trails, theatre, workshops, puppetry, carnivals, all sorts of silliness. It's really interactive. And there's kind of every art form that you might imagine. And the tagline for our festival is Adventures in Utopia. And that's really what we've sought to provide. People do come for the music, but actually it's about an adventure into the unknown, discovering new acts, discovering poets and comedians and workshops and, paddleboarding on the lake, discovering, just going on a journey through that weekend to see what you might come across. And really that's a result of there never being an intention to make profit or to create a particular product. It's more been an organic evolution of collective effort. So we would describe Shambala more in the sense of a creative ecosystem or a community that has grown over these 25 years. That's not to say it's not sustainable financially. We're still here. We're still thriving. We sold out last year in a tough market. So it is a sustainable business, but first and foremost, it's a cultural offer.
I mean, it's such a fantastic ethos from both the community point of view and the sustainability point of view. You mentioned that climate and sustainability is something that's always been important to you personally. From Shambala's point of view, at what point did sustainability become central to the festival's identity, or was it kind of there from the get-go?
I'd say in the first few years, it really was just a party, the best party we could put on. And it was about gathering people and music and all sorts of silliness and wonderful things on the side. But I would say sustainability became important to us as we started to have families. And it's probably a good 15 plus years where sustainability became really central to the values. And we realised we had an opportunity not just to live by our own values. We've always been very aligned as co-founders and a wider team, but also to use this amazing opportunity of having so many people in one place to live our values. I mean, from a personal perspective for us all, it's been an extraordinary experience to be able to live our values through something and to have a voice. And we've always felt that there's almost a moral duty to use this incredible opportunity of having a captive audience and a media profile to say something good, not just our own voices, but to provide space for diverse voices. And essentially, there's something which underpins Shambala, which is that we can make a contribution to the world. And so sustainability for many years was the focus of that contribution, both in terms of how we could reduce the impacts of the festival, but how we could show some leadership and how we could provoke useful conversations.
And part of that reducing impact piece, you chose to take fish and meats off the menu of the festival and become vegetarian. What did you learn from that decision in terms of how far you can kind of push an audience on sustainability yourselves? And was there any pushback actually from the visitors?
So this is one of my favourite stories, going meat and fish free, and we did learn a lot. Back in 2015, it was the time when Cowspiracy had been released. Everyone was talking about the sort of shocking and extensive impacts of the meat industry and agriculture in general. So we seized the moment, really. We have learned over the years that if there's already something in the public consciousness and we jump onto it, it's far more effective in terms of a campaign or behaviour change. So we jumped on the bandwagon and we made the decision to go meat and fish free. Now, we didn't take this decision lightly because we realised that food is a very emotive topic for people. And we'd also surveyed our audience. And actually, I think 78% of audience did say they eat meat and fish. So it's not like we're talking to the converted. So we were very careful, and we were actually a little nervous about this whole thing. So we did the research. We tried to be as well informed as we could, to provide the arguments on the website and why we were doing it, and that we don't think everyone should be vegan. But we did take seriously this opportunity to take a values-based decision for the festival, but also to provoke the conversation. We often do things because we want to provoke a positive conversation, promote dialogue. And so we went meat and fish free, and it sent shockwaves across the festival industry in the UK and Europe. We were quite surprised. And it did create lots of debate online. And a minority of people did feel offended. You know, they really felt that it wasn't our right to dictate how they should eat. Now, I do hear that to a certain extent, but it's also our right as a business to manage our business in a sustainable way. And also, you can choose to go to a festival or not. There's hundreds. The most important thing for us was we needed to make this a really positive experience for people. If you imagine that you put yourself in a sales role for a better future, if you're selling something, it has to be good. So we put a huge amount of effort into working with the trader community to make sure that the menu was genuinely delicious, affordable, diverse, healthy. We also were quite pragmatic. So we didn't go vegan. People think we're a vegan festival. We're not. We're a vegetarian festival. There still is a small amount of dairy, which is organic, in our ecosystem, because we wanted to sort of be a little bit pragmatic, you know, taking away some of those late night snacks, you know, cheese on chips, or, you know, taking away pizza. If you're not a vegan, the vegan pizzas just doesn't cut the mustard, let's be honest. So we were really careful to provide people with a really good experience. And what was interesting for us is what we learned. So before doing this initiative, we didn't have a tangible sense or any evidence or data about how people's experiences at the festival impact their daily lives. We just had this sort of general sense that it was a positive influence. So anecdotally, people would say, hey, I was really inspired by that talk or your policy on this, and it changed my life in X, Y, and Z. Or, you know, we might be working with charities and encouraging people to sign up. And so there was some evidence that someone taking part in a festival would make some new decisions or change their minds. But this was amazing. We surveyed our audience post-event, and we have really good take-up on our survey. So we consider that it's representative samples. And more than 50% of meat eaters said they had drastically changed their diet as a result of the experience of the festival. Now, it's a good signal, but we also know that people answer favourably, and maybe a week after the festival, people are feeling inspired, and who knows whether that change is sustained 6 months later. So we surveyed that cohort of people 6 months later who said they had drastically changed their diet, and 70% of them said they had sustained that change. So that was the first time as a festival that we really had like tangible evidence that what we do as a festival can impact people's life decisions.
That is a crazy statistic, to have avid meat eaters saying that really fed through into their daily life. That is amazing. On the topic of the menu, earlier this year, you guys made the decision you put it to a vote on whether you'd introduce British venison to the menu. It was obviously kind of a controversial choice. So could you walk us through the decision to put that to a vote? Why was that even on the cards?
Sure. So I guess there's a serious side and a naughty side to this. The serious side is that, as I think is well known now, it's in the broadsheets, there are no predators for our deer populations. They breed like mad. The populations are huge. They eat all new growth, and they significantly impact biodiversity. So we've got a problem. And it's not a new idea that we need to sort of cull deer. And we were thinking, well, if we're culling them, let's eat them. It's the most sustainable option for meat. It's domestic, it's wild, it's healthy. You know, there's nothing not to like really about eating deer. So we thought this is a great opportunity to kind of reinvigorate this conversation that we've had over the years with our audience about food and about meat. We knew that it was contentious, the idea of putting meat back on the menu. So we put it to a vote. I actually thought that our audience would be quite pragmatic and understand the ecological argument. I think they did, and vote to have it on the menu. Like what we were proposing was simply one stall with only wild meat. So it would have been, you know, the best situation. And we were going to work with gamekeepers around the festival site to actually cull deer from the local area. However, we launched it. It was picked up in national press. We even had an appeal from Chris Packham not to do it. And I do actually understand and appreciate his argument. He was saying, look, you've already taken that move to be vegetarian. So leave it to other festivals to replace unsustainable meat with sustainable meat. A huge amount of respect for Chris Peckham. But anyway, the audience voted no, which I was personally quite surprised about. And what we learned is that there is a real strength of feeling around Shambala being simply meat-free, the clarity of that, the feeling. We know that people have all sorts of reasons to be vegetarian or vegan. So we really learned that there's a real strength of feeling around that to not have any animals in our menu was important to people. We also learned that quite a few people think we're a vegan festival. And going back to that original decision of being meat and fish free, we were very clear before we took that step that we would not be a vegan festival, that we did not want to be labelled as a vegan festival because we felt that the label vegan alienates. So we've always tried to take quite a pragmatic approach. It's about climate, it's about health, it's about fairness, but we've never suggested that people should be vegan, even though, of course, a plant-based diet is an extremely good idea, given that we're having a climate and ecological breakdown. Of course, that's a good idea. But we try and sort of position ourselves pragmatically so that the appeal of the conversations and the policies and the ideas that we're putting forward is wider.
With the public vote, in the same vein as like redistributing some of the decision-making power to customers and your kind of wider followers, Shambala also recently made the switch to become the UK's first employee-owned festival. So what was it that prompted that decision, and what will worker ownership actually change about how you guys make decisions?
Okay, well, the honest answer is that after 25 years, as a group of co-founders, we were thinking it's time to move on. We're still completely in love with the festival, we'll still contribute on an ongoing basis, but as the shareholders, owners and senior management, it just feels time to pass this on to the next generation. So we feel like we've done our time and maybe we're becoming elders and we'll be around to sort of help in whatever way the team needs us. But I guess as a group of co-founders or as a co-founder of a festival business, you've basically got three options. You can close it and say we've had a good run. You can sell it to a larger organisation, usually VC backed or a large entertainment company, or we could be employee owned. And when we were considering kind of what the future looked like, especially, COVID provoked us to really think about where we were going to go with our lives. And it's a tough gig running a festival, as we all know. It hits the press how many festivals are going down each year. And we were really thinking kind of what is the future? And for us, it landed that it was just the right thing to do, that if we were going to sell the business or pass the business on, that its future sat with the group of people who are making it happen. So we have a team of 18 here in Bristol who are employed, and now they are the owners. And it just feels right. I guess it's a bit anti-capitalist. I mean, as a group, we're not ardently anti-capitalist, but I suppose that we want to do things differently. We don't want to be part of an economic system which pushes profits up the chain to a few. We do want to distribute profits and have everyone as a valued member of the team.
Absolutely makes sense. I mean, a lot of festivals I know have had a lot of pushback from fans because of not the festival themselves, but the company that ends up buying them, and the visitors, the customers, they don't stand for what that owning company stands for. And then that creates a division of, well, now I can no longer support the festival. So I think putting it into the hands of the employees is such an interesting idea.
There's another element to this which feels important, is that whilst effectively we are no longer in control of the business that we co-founded and previously owned, as of a couple of months ago, we've now completed the process. There is the ability for exiting shareholders and co-founders to influence the values. Now, it's not legally required, but there is something called a letter of wishes when you exit as a co-founder. And that is a plea, really, to the next generation to maintain the values and integrity of the business. So the mission values, the identity, and the letter of wishes all come together and give a reasonable chance of the business maintaining its values in future.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. So now kind of zooming out to the industry as a whole, I think it was 2015 when the Show Must Go On sustainability report was published about the state of the festival industry, live music industry. How far do you think the industry has moved in the last 10 or so years?
Sure. So we published the first Show Must Go On report in 2015, which was a response to COP21. As a festival industry, we got together and decided we wanted to show leadership. We wanted to be part of this global movement. So someone actually cycled that first report to Paris to symbolically present it to COP21. Since then, we've published a second and a third edition of that report. So we're tracking progress across the industry. We've just published the third edition in February, which was launched in the House of Commons. And it's also been recognised in the recently published government's music industry plan called Turn It Up, Our Plan for Music. So it's absolutely fantastic. We're now working across the industry. This report, in terms of data from nearly 90 festivals, has been an unprecedented collaboration across the industry. And we're now working with government to look at the kind of policy and support that will unlock some of the systemic barriers to sustainability. Since the first report in 2015, we've seen a huge amount of change in the industry in areas like reusable cups, travel planning, recycling. There's been some amazing advances in energy, batteries, grid connections. So I would say that the festival industry as a whole is maturing, but we still have systemic barriers. Now, in this recent report that was published, we also created a climate transition plan 2030 for the industry. And what we've been able to do is model where we are now in terms of the emissions and impacts of the industry in a typical festival, and where we need to get to if we aim to reduce the emissions from the festival industry by 50%. So we now have that modelled. We now know what we need to do to get to 50%. The good news is that we've identified that typical events could change practices or introduce initiatives that could reach around 37% reductions. The bad news is we can't get to 50% with what's available to the average festival organiser. And that's where the conversations with government around policy start. One point of interest for me is that 91% of the festival industry or live events industry is actually micro to small events. It's the fabric of our cultural landscape, often run by volunteers or community organisations. So what we're really doing with this next phase of the Show Must Go On report and climate transition plan is looking at how we can support small events to make changes. And we've introduced something called the Green Events Code of Practice, which is a baseline for environmental practice in the UK, so that we know what good looks like, so that it's simple for smaller events to understand what good looks like. We're working with government and with local authorities to roll out the Green Events Code of Practice as a national standard.
You've already touched on COVID and the impact that had, and with the, I don't know, was it a 2-year pause in the large scale events, it forced a lot of organisers to kind of step back and force them into acknowledging and doing some work on sustainability in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have done if they weren't forced to take that break. You also mentioned that, you know, there's a lot of festivals that have been struggling, have had to close down. So do you think that 4 years on from the pandemic, has the sustainability momentum held across the industry? Or do you think that with the commercial pressure, with the fear of closing down, do you think that's pushed sustainability back down the agenda?
So I think, as we're all aware, just before COVID, we had this kind of crescendo of public opinion and interest and industry engagement in the environment. Many people talked about the blue planet effect. Then COVID hit and many industries, including festivals, of course, went into survival mode. And since COVID and Brexit, the economic model for the festival industry is genuinely challenging. Huge increases in supply chain costs, cost of living having an impact on sales. So yes, definitely for smaller events, we have seen that survival is the priority. And I think for some events, sustainability has gone down the ladder. But what we're seeing with the medium to large events, who have played a leadership role for many years, is that sustainability is still high on the agenda. And actually, with the launch of the Show Must Go On report and climate transition plan this year, what we're seeing is a huge groundswell and engagement in sustainability again in our industry. An interesting fact, we've now got the data to fully understand the emissions footprint of a typical UK festival, and it's remarkably low. It's just under 16 kilograms per person per day. Now, if we compare that to the average footprint of a UK citizen, and this is from the Office for National Statistics, it's double that. So it's counterintuitive. People sometimes see festivals as high impact events or high impact holidays. You'll see pictures of tents in the national newspapers and think, oh, wow, they're so wasteful. Actually, your share of energy on site is so small compared to being in a building. There almost isn't another holiday type other than going to a local campsite, which is a lower carbon holiday. And even including the travel to get there and back, your footprint is lower at a festival than staying at home. Once you start to think about it, it does make sense, because if you're at home, you might be having a bath, using the washing machine, you know, turning on a kettle, which is a 3 kilowatt appliance. You know, you're using a lot of energy, and you're probably using your car even if it's local trips. So when you're camping, you might have a small gas bottle for the camp stove, but you're using a minimal amount of energy.
Mm. I think the lesson there is go to a lot more festivals and you're saving the planet. One of the biggest, if not the biggest driver of emissions for festivals is the travel. So however many thousands of visitors get to the site. But that's obviously also one of the hardest things to control. Like you can control your vendors, you can put forward recycling waste management schemes, but travel you can't necessarily dictate. So what would you say has actually been working in terms of making travel more sustainable?
There's a number of measures that festivals have been putting in place for a while which do reduce travel emissions successfully. They may seem obvious, but it's coaches, dedicated festival coaches, especially for younger audiences. It's actually a great experience to jump on the coach, feel like the festival has already begun when you leave London or Bristol or wherever, and incentivising those with subsidies. So making sure the price point is low really encourages people to use them. Lift sharing, of course, train and shuttle bus. Quite a few festivals are putting packages together around green traveller options, including kind of train and shuttle with either free shuttles or low-cost shuttles, just to try and make it more convenient. There's also some really interesting stuff happening in cities and with day concepts around travel. For instance, the Act 1.5 Massive Attack event in Bristol. They did some really amazing work looking at releasing tickets by local postcode first, working with the local rail operators to offer discounts. So yeah, there's a lot happening in our industry at the moment around sustainable travel. And I think there's a huge opportunity to work with government as well. We've got the formation of Great British Rail, and I think there's an opportunity there for the cultural sector at large, including festivals and live music events, to have that conversation with government to make travel to cultural events more accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. This brings me to my last question, actually. What's one thing you've either done at Shambala or one attitude, ambition you've got that you most want to see scaled across the industry? And what do you think is stopping that from being scaled at the moment?
It's hard to put one thing forward. We were very early on reusable cups. We were one of the first UK festivals to introduce reusable cups. We had to work with a French company at the time, and it just seemed crazy that we were transporting cups from France, but we knew it was the future and we wanted to model it. So reusable cups, that has become widespread in the UK already. Last year we trialled biogas. So for cooking, heating, etc. We were the first UK festival to use biogas rather than LPG, and I think that's important. But it has to be the meat and fish free. Relatively few festivals have done this. Understandably, festival organisers are nervous about what their audiences think. But if we look at the reality of the climate and ecological breakdown and the impact that consuming industrially produced meat has on the environment, then that has to be number one, to move towards a plant-based diet. And I choose my words carefully. Again, thinking about the pragmatic stance that we take at Shambala, we would say move towards a plant-based diet rather than be vegan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even if it's just for, that one weekend, if you can reduce meat consumption across however many thousands, and as you've already said, if that can kind of trickle down into their daily lives, then the impact could be absolutely huge. And it doesn't mean giving up meat forever. I think that's all we've got time for today, but thank you so much, Chris, for jumping on this call, and best of luck with the last few weeks of organising and getting everything together. I'll keep my fingers crossed for the weather for you guys.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thanks to Chris once again for his time. So that brings our guest interviews for today's episode to an end. But before we go, is there anything that you guys want to flag to the listeners?
Well, we do have a new, I suppose product is the word, offering on edie at the moment. So we are doing more kind of EU focused stuff. The European Union is really kind of rolling out a lot of policy changes right now. I think at the time of recording this, the AI Act has just come into force, which doesn't really actually have any environmental touch points, but it does show that the bloc in general is really kind of shaping how businesses are regulated across multiple different subjects. And keeping track of that can be a bit of a mess. So we do have a new kind of interactive live tracker that's pinned to the top of the site now, our EU Climate Policy Tracker. Basically updates key legislative frameworks from ETS to CBAM to Industrial Accelerator Acts, Green Clean Clothes Directives, anything that kind of has sustainability implications. We will essentially endeavour to have a pager explainer on that legislation in terms of what it's mandating, what the timeframes are, what the business implications are, as well as updates with latest stories from across many respected EU publications, as well as our own about changes or implications to those legislations. So on CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, for example, there's been some research out about how Indian steelmakers, which have been lobbying against it, aren't actually going to have to pay as much as they first thought. So we will provide that context through the live document for our members there. So it's been a big piece of work for the guys over the summer. That's now up and running, which I'm really excited about. And now we've got the job of just keeping on top and keeping it updated to the many changes. As long as there's no omnibus simplification package coming this summer, like early spring last year, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, a lot of blood, sweat and tears went into that tracker, and it is looking great up on the site. And further afield, Matt, you've already mentioned that obviously we're in the middle of a triple COP year, and the next time you'll be hearing from us will be coming to the end of the first of those conferences, and that's the desertification COP, which is probably the least well known of the COPs we've got going on this year. So Sidhi, could you give us a quick intro into what we can expect?
Yeah, happily. As you said, it is the least well-known COP, but hopefully this year will change that, because desertification COP focuses on topics that are making the headlines this year: drought resilience, water management, land degradation, soil degradation. So it's one of the 3 UNFCCC COPs held in 1 year under the Rio Conventions, and this year it's happening in Mongolia. It starts on the 17th of August, ends on the 28th, and this year on the agenda we'll have, for the first time, tracking of the progress towards the 1.5 billion hectares restoration of degraded land by 2030 target, so also known as the land degradation neutrality target. Another big area of focus would be drought policy and water resilience, and then something that businesses would want to think about is private investments into soil health, sustainable agriculture, and ecosystem restoration will also be on the agenda, and it is something that's affecting all businesses across their supply chains. Another very important part of the agenda is on food insecurity in vulnerable regions, and even countries that didn't think they were vulnerable to the impacts of heat waves. We've kind of realize that they are. Supply chains are more complicatedly linked than accounted for. And then obviously the issues of forced migration and what it means for Indigenous communities. So it is a very action-focused agenda, and we'll be covering it comprehensively. And yeah, I will urge our listeners to check our site between 17th to 28th of August to stay on top of what's happening at the desertification COP this year.
Yeah, absolutely. In the lead up to the desertification COP and the 2 that are coming up later on in the year, we'll be bringing you some essential explainers, analysis and exclusive interviews to help you make sense of all of the negotiations. So yeah, make sure you're staying tuned and you keep checking edie.net for that. But in terms of next time, on the topic of desertification and water risk, for the next episode we'll be taking a deeper look at climate risk, and specifically how that's measured and how that's managed in the world of finance. So make sure you're subscribed wherever you're listening to this episode so you don't miss it. But for today, it's a goodbye from Matt.
Goodbye.
A goodbye from Sidhi.
Goodbye.
And a goodbye from me. Goodbye.